This podcast is brought to you by Odyssey. Engineered and manufactured in Southern California, Odyssey's award-winning LCD headphones combine the latest innovations in material science with precision craftsmanship. Find out why some of the world's leading sound professionals can now produce, mix, and master anywhere with Odyssey headphones. Learn more at odyssey.com.
Hey, it's Larry Crane. Welcome to the Tape Op Podcast. First interviewed in Tape Op some 20 years ago, Jack Endino has been a staple of the Northwest music and recording scene for over 30 years. He describes himself as the guy in the engine room during the early voyages of the battleship Grunge in the late 80s, and many of the early releases that put Seattle label Sub Pop on the map have his name on them. Artists like Mudhoney, Nirvana, Tad, Soundgarden, L7, Mark Lanegan, and Hot Hot Heat are just a few of the many bands that Jack has guided through their recordings. I caught up with Jack at Seattle's Soundhouse studio, and we carried on as only two old friends can. Enjoy! Well, this conversation is going to be awesome. We're just going to ramble around. That's really that's something that when I built the studio, I was like, people are like, can you get automation on your console? You know, at this point in time, this console automation is something you really need anymore.
I never needed it in the first place. I never needed it. I hated console automation. Yeah. It drove me insane. It slowed me down so much.
Right.
And, you know, every board had like its learning curve for these creepy DOS-based programs that they were using for the automation. Right. And I know people who swore by automation, but it's because they worked on one console all the time. Right. And they got used to it and they were able to fly through it. And it drove me insane because I don't like having to work real time. I was over it as soon as I got done with analog. Yeah. And it's like, okay, I got to run through the track. Okay, now we're going to do all the mutes. Okay, now we're going to do this and that, and it's just the whole thing. And, and I was always working in different studios and it was like, okay, which one do I have to learn now? Okay, now I'm not going to use this console again for a year, so I'll completely forget the automation. Right. And, the last time I was confronted with an SSL, and it was a Pro Tools system, and I realized, okay, Pro Tools is automation. Why do I need to have this stupid antique console chasing this Pro Tools system? So I just said, turn the automation off. Mm-hmm. Turn everything off. We're just going to use the console, the SSL, in snapshot mode now for this record. Right. I'm going to do all the automation in Pro Tools. And that was kind of an eye-opener because it worked really good. Mm-hmm. And I had another revelation when I did that. This was in 2001. It was one of the last times I mixed through an SSL console, which, like I said, I always hate them. But I decided I would A/B the EQs inside Pro Tools with the EQs on the console. Yeah. And specifically, I was using McDSP EQ on everything. Mm-hmm. I'm a big McDSP fan. And so what I would do is I would set up the mix on the SSL for a couple hours using the onboard EQs. Mm-hmm. Okay, here it is. I'm using the little compressors and the EQs and everything, and I got it sounding pretty good. And then I turned all the EQ off on the board, and I took a break. I came back, and I proceeded to instantiate the EQ plugins on all the channels in Pro Tools, and I was like, okay, now I'm going to work away on the drums, and I worked away through it, and I was okay, I'm going to get everything sounding the way I want to, one channel at a time. Yeah. So I got all the EQs the way I wanted them to sound inside Pro Tools. Yeah. And then I A/B'd it, the internal mix I had going in Pro Tools versus sending all the channels out through the SSL. And I called the drummer in. I said, okay, let's listen to these. I think it was specifically the drums I was working with for the most part. And it was no contest. We listened to through the board versus me doing it with all the EQs in Pro Tools. And we picked the digital one hands down.
Was it still coming down the channel strip?
It was coming down the channel strip of the SSL with all the EQs turned off. Right. It was literally my experiment was I took a whole afternoon in the studio. This is one of those records I did in Brazil where I had a month in the studio. I was like, all right, I'm going to experiment. And it was kind of an eye-opener. I was like, okay, this digital EQ thing is mature and I can trust it. And from then on, I did the rest of that record without using any of the EQ on the console. It was literally just a huge summing bus. Right. And the SSL is good for that.
Right.
The summing is great, and the noise is low, and whatever. It's got the onboard compressor, which I don't use.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was only a matter of time before I was dragged kicking and screaming into the mixing entirely in the box world,
Right.
which is where I'm at now. And I have to give Barrett Jones credit for
Really?
encouraging me at that, because he's been doing it far longer than I have. I talked to him a few years ago, and I've been mixing in the box forever. I was like, really? And then I know Adam Casper's been doing it, and he wasn't exactly an early. He was like me. He was an old analog guy who kind of got dragged into the digital world. And anyway, here I am now. People send me stuff to mix from like Italy and places. Someone sent me stuff from Belarus a couple of months ago, and they just send you Pro Tools files, and you have your way with them and send them back, and they tell you what to change.
Yeah, it's a different world with that. When you talk about that, then what's the purpose of the studio at a certain point? If you're mixing in the box and.
Well, you still need a studio. You need the infrastructure of the mics and the preamps and the headphones and all that stuff. You need all that.
Well, for tracking.
Tracking, you need all that infrastructure,
Absolutely.
really. And I have to say, it's much easier to get a headphone mix on a big analog console.
Right.
You can there's all the auxes, and you can just dial, and rather than doing it with a mouse where you're looking at one control at a time.
Yeah.
But even then, there's, I've seen people I know who come in here to Soundhouse, and they do their whole thing in the box, including the headphones.
Right.
I remember the first time I saw that, I was like watching very carefully, like, wait a minute, are you really doing this? Really? And they just immediately set up like a bus A, B, C, D, and they've got they had a template, it was all ready to go, loaded it into Pro Tools, and got the headphones going in no time. And I thought, wow, okay, so.
It's one way to work.
I know, but I like having the old console to work through, at least for tracking. It just makes everything so much faster. And I mean, the preamps are good.
Yeah.
You got that. I mean, you've got at least got these mic preamps, if nothing else.
But when it comes to mixing, do you do projects where you work on it a bit at home or other places, or do you always work in the studio?
I'll work in the studio, and if I'm working in the box in the studio, I'll double check it at home.
Right.
Because I have a living room set up that's like, it's got these speakers that actually I've been mastering on these old KRK 9000s, which are the same speakers John Golden used to use.
Oh, funny.
And I have them set up in my living room. And not the same make. I mean, he obviously has his own. I got them from somewhere else.
Yeah.
But so I always, I was run in my house and double check the mixes in there.
Cool.
Like, oh, wait, the kick's too loud. Oh, tweak, which I think is crucial. I mean, some people run out to their cars. But my Buick only has a cassette deck, so that's a little...
print it over to cassette.
Yeah, that's no longer practical.
Yikes.
That's what I did in the 80s.
Oh, yeah, we all did, didn't we?
I would run out to the car, we'll make a cassette, Oh, shit, it's playing at the wrong speed.
Yeah, the great thing about that was you could record the next song, you could record back over it.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas once people started making me burn CDs.
Burn CDs is like throwing in the garbage.
And you'd have like a stack of dead CDs
oh,
at
yeah,
the end of the session.
I'd always like, no, give me back that CD. That's not the final mix. No, give me that. We're throwing that away.
Yeah, totally. And when you be paranoid, I'd be snapping them in half so nobody tried to play them.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so crazy. But I was thinking the other day, I was talking to Susan Rogers, who was in town to being interviewed. She worked with Prince and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And she teaches at Berkeley, and she said that she uses a thing you print on your website about tape decks and different how tape response and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah, all those curves I took back when I was doing a lot of analog.
Yeah, and she said that really it's something she teaches. She presents that to all of her students in a recording program, and she wanted to say thank you for putting that information out there.
Well, I mean, Colin McDowell ended up using that because he has a tape. One of the old McDSP plugins is called Analog Channel.
Right.
It's one of the original 4 plugins he came up with like 15 years ago or something, and it's meant to be a tape simulator.
Yeah.
And one of the things he did is he actually took the graphs off my website and put them in the instruction manual for the very first version of that plugin. And that was a long time ago. He gave me a free copy of the plugin.
Yeah.
But I need to update that because the graphs I made in like, the late 90s.
Yeah.
So that they're super low res now. They're just tiny little GIFs,
Yeah, right.
I really should like remake those because they're so small. But whatever, that was those days. I'm not really a big web maintenance guy anymore. I can barely maintain my website. I just don't have time.
Oh, I know.
The internet just wears me down.
It's got, I think at the beginning of the the internet revolution or whatever, I think the promise or the hope was that you could have sites like, say, your Endino.com.
I got my own .com, man.
And that people would really gravitate towards that and would utilize all these unique sites on the web, and it turned into Facebook instead.
I know. And
it's a sad thing.
Yeah.
We find that like with the Tape-Op website, it's really hard to drive people to it. They'll look at some stupid thing on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook and make comments all day, but to get them to go to a real website that's full of information is difficult, and that's just fascinatingly terrifying.
It is, because they're all sort of, the whole like social media thing has become so, okay, you've got their app on your phone, it's constantly dinging. I don't have any apps on my phone. I never even registered my phone with Google, actually. I have an Android that is not associated with a Google account.
Nice.
You can do that. You just, when you get the phone, you just don't ever register it with Google with an email address or anything else.
Yeah.
So AT&T knows I have this phone, but Google doesn't. They don't have I don't even use Gmail except when Yahoo Mail is down.
Yeah.
I may have to change that at some point, but I don't know. I'll use Proton Mail or something else.
Yeah.
But, so as a result, I can't put any apps on my phone, but I don't want any apps on my phone. It's like, texting is enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's too much. I mean, if you think about the course of a day, you should be getting things done, not looking at your phone.
Constantly checking the phone.
The jobs come through emails.
Yeah, they do.
They really don't.
They really do.
Or they come to you directly from people you know well.
It's like if people call you, they're like, "Hi, do you make records?" Which is just like, oh,
can I come in and sing tonight?
Who wants to take this call? Anybody? Some intern? Somebody? You want this gig?
I remember my friend was working for me, Joanna, who plays with Stephen Malkmus. And she was working there, and she picks up the phone, and she goes, "No, we don't do demos." Hangs it up. I'm like, "Oh my God, you might want to be a little more pleasant,
just a little careful." Well, I mean, I kind of say the same thing. Everything in like 30 years of doing this, almost nothing I've ever done has stayed a demo.
Right?
I mean, it's like literally, even back in the 80s and 90s, like everything I touched got released eventually by some indie label somewhere, and I really got to the point, I was like, well, I don't do demos. I mean, I treat everything like it's going to be released. You know what I mean? It's like calling it a demo is just kind of like dooming it from the start. Okay, we're just going to make a shitty recording. Can we pay you to make a shitty recording for us that we don't care about and call it a demo? I'm like, well,
it doesn't make any sense.
Why would I do that? That's not what I do. I mean, look, you sang it badly, sing it again. Let's get it good. So, but, and the few times I've done demos, decades later, I've ended up having to go back and remix them because somebody decides they want to release it anyway,
Right. I mean, that's a lot of work. You were just mentioning before we started rolling this that you got Green River and all these bands you're remixing old recordings.
Remixing ancient recordings I did, including so-called demos we did like 30 years ago that actually sound pretty good now.
Right.
So, I don't do demos. I treat everything like it's an album. On the other hand, I do work fast if I have to.
Yeah.
And I tell people, because they say, well, how long do you think we need? Which is, how do you answer that?
I don't know how to answer that.
I say, well, look, I can work fast if you can, but, there's two wild cards. It's the drummer's a wild card and the singer's a wild card. It's like, the drummer could take, he could get all your drum takes done in a day, or it could take him a week, depends on how good he is. Right. And vocals, they can take an hour or a day or a week, It's like, what kind of singer are you, and what are you demanding of yourself while you do your vocals, and are you going to sing scratch vocals all day and then try and do the vocal takes at night? Yeah. It usually doesn't work. You fried your voice out doing the scratch vocals, There's a lot of wild cards, and you have to explain to people, no, come back later and do the vocals. Yeah. Don't plan it so you're going to sing all the vocals on the last day of recording. Yeah, okay, now we're done with everything else. Let's get the vocals done. And 3 or 4 songs in, your voice is shot. It's like, no, break it up. And I tell people, let's just do a couple days of tracking and then see where it goes. Yeah. Because you can't say, records come in all shapes and sizes. Mm-hmm. And people ask me this constantly with mixing. They say, how much do you charge to mix 10 songs? Yeah. And I just sent someone that email this morning. I said, well, I need to know the dimensions of it. How long is all of it? How many minutes of music is it? And there's one dimension. And the other dimension is how deep is it? Is it like 20 tracks or 80 tracks for each song? Because back when it was analog, you knew it was going to be 24 tracks. You'd be like, okay,
more.
we've got like 40 minutes of material recorded on 24 track, and you could give, I could give at least some idea of, I can probably do that in 3 or 4 days, whatever. But now it's like, well, I don't know, send me the most complicated song as a zip file. You don't even need to send me the audio file. Just send me the Pro Tools, the PTX
look
document.
at it,
I'll just look at it and see how far it scrolls on the screen, and then and I've even turned things down. I just look at it, it's scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. I'm just like, oh, my life's too short for this, No, somebody will make a nice mix of this, but it doesn't have to be me.
Yeah, that's.
You know
I mean,
what I
when things get, I've worked on things up to like 150 tracks or something.
I would go insane. I just have no patience because it takes you dude,
Yeah.
you're like days of just looking at it and studying it to try and understand what's there and what the intent was behind it.
We were kind of adding to stuff that was pre-recorded, so we were kind of producing.
Well,
it.
see, if you had done the tracking,
Some
you
of
already
the
knew what it
tracking-
was at least.
Yeah,
that's a different story. You've already got it in your head the whole time.
We had a plan.
But if someone just like throws it at you that somebody else recorded, you don't know the relative importance of these 75 guitar tracks. It's like, well, which one is how do I know what?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it could be this way, it could be this way, it could be this
difficult.
way. What do I do with this? How long is it even going to take me to form an opinion?
Yeah.
And, times like that, it's like, you can't afford me, sorry.
It's really, you got to say no or get away from it.
Well, you got to have a life.
So I remember a good handful of years ago, I think we were talking and you were like, I'm just done with tape. As far as a tracking medium and such.
Even thinking about analog tape just fills me with inertia at this point.
And people might think, based on, how all of us started, was working on tape.
Oh, yeah, we were all cutting it with razor blades and the whole deal. I remember doing insane edits to drum fills to shorten them, where you're trimming like an eighth of an inch of tape out of the 2-inch tape before each drum hit because the drum fill slowed down a little bit.
Right.
You know what I mean? You're marking it with the grease pencil and then you're it's just, no, thank you.
I think it's interesting though. People might think that we, that grew up working in that way, that we'd have more
nostalgia,
romantic vision of it or something. But, I think, I remember talking to you and I was just, some of it was just the sheer drudgery or
tedium
of having to try to make things happen that were very difficult to do on tape.
Yeah, and also having to wait for the machine to rewind. Okay, hang on, we'll do another take.
Yeah.
Oh, I overshot the mark here. Okay, wait, it's chasing it. Okay, now we're at oh shit, I didn't punch in quite at the right moment. Oh, god damn it, we have to record that track again.
Oh, yeah.
And I hit erase on the wrong channel. Oh, bummer.
No kick drum.
Yeah, and you only do that once in your career. And it's usually early, and it was for me. It was literally within the first couple months of me recording, I erased somebody's vocal track by mistake.
Oh, God.
It's you never do that again,
Yeah, you really. The worst is the flipping the tape over to do backwards stuff and forgetting
which track is which. You got to be very careful when you do the backwards thing that you're recording on the correct channel.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah, I think that happened to me the first time I did it, and then never again.
Oh God. Oh no, we only have one overhead. It's not stereo.
Right. Okay. Yeah, let's not go there. Yeah, we could make a whole podcast out of engineering errors. It would be brutal.
Maybe
there'd be a lot of anonymous quotes. Actually, I think.
We won't say whose record this was done to.
No. Which released record had the monos, the overheads in mono when they should have been stereo? Ooh, forgot to pan them.
Oh my God.
Things like that. There's a lot of things that are just the scalpel is left inside the patient. Nobody's going to know.
I mean, you've had that one that you just mentioned. You're sitting there and you print the mix and you look over and you're like, oh my God, I forgot I monoed the overheads because I was checking phase.
Yeah,
and
right.
I didn't put them back.
And no one's ever going to hear it, and no one does.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that happened to me once in 1986. It was a single. Nobody ever cared.
Right.
But it was one of those things that you just don't forget. Don't do that again.
Yeah.
Write myself a note.
I mean, I think that's recording and producing and running studios and doing all the things. There's so many details to the tasks at hand that I think it's really, that's one of the things that maybe people forget when they're starting out and learning is that you're going to have to know all these different things.
You've got to keep track of it. You've got to keep track of 20 or 30 detailed signal paths.
Yeah.
both going in and coming back out of the machine that you're recording on.
Yeah.
There's all this signal path options, and there's the headphone paths, and you've got to keep a lot straight in your mind. Your brain has to encompass this elaborate structure that you create in order to have a successful recording session. There's all these, I mean, you know how to the patch bay, you'll be just like, every patch cord will be used for some sessions, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Every one of those patch cords represents a decision that you made and that you have to keep track of.
Yeah. It could come loose, too. It could lose
I know,
contact.
right? Like, oh, it's dropped 6 dB. Shit. Wait, wiggle it. Okay. Yeah, I know. And the whole thing, and the whole problem solving thing that you have to be very good at to keep a session running. If something happens, you got to solve it to keep the energy going. You can't have the band standing there with headphones looking at you while you're solving a problem. You got to be able to, like, okay, we're patching around that. Okay, wait a minute, let me get you another cable. Okay, another headphone. Yeah, here it is, you know. And you just got to try solving problems on the fly so that your problems don't become their problems.
That's true.
You know, they have to, it has to be as transparent for the band as possible so that, you know, and I'm happy when the band after the session comes in and says, man, that was the easiest recording session we've ever had.
Right.
That was great. You know, and I'm just like, oh, yes, all right, it worked.
Yeah, you're trying to hide the, you know, stuff behind the curtain. You know?
Well, yeah, they shouldn't have to watch me solve.
Yeah.
They shouldn't have to watch engineer drama.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Oh, shit, that thing blew up. What do we do? I mean, I've rebiased people's amps in the studio.
Yeah.
I've resoldered things. I've fixed people's, you know, gear. I'd be like, wait, let me intonate your guitar. I'll do it like 5 minutes. It's done. You know, okay, now we can record the guitar. It'll be in tune. You know, and it's just like problem solving.
Yeah.
And you got to be quick, because they're paying you by the hour, and their energy is only going to last so long. You know, there's a lot to it, you know, and you know, when you get the interns in here and they've been to school or whatever, it's how do you just got to throw them in the deep end of the pool.
And then they make the mistakes, and then they learn from them.
Yeah, I know. You know, give the clients a discount. You know, don't be afraid to charge nothing if you feel like things didn't go well.
Yeah,
you know?
that's true.
Honestly, you can't take people's money unless you're feeling like you're doing a good job.
I mean, part of the thing is being graceful at this and leaving a good impression. Like you said, like people saying that, oh, that went so smooth or something. You know, the things that you need as a producer engineer is like good word of mouth and happy clients, you know?
Yes.
You know, sometimes it's not so much, I mean, I feel like my early recordings were not so much like great fidelity or anything, but I worked with bands that people cared about, and I made everyone as happy as I could in the moment. You know?
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
Like, and that's how people talk, why they talk about you, you know? Or they want you to work on things because of those connections.
When's the last time you had a business card?
Oh, I got them, but...
Do you?
Yeah, but, you know, I hand them out occasionally. But
I haven't had a business card in decades.
Yeah.
Except Stu Hallerman, for some reason, made me some business cards as a joke once. They were cute. Had some goofy thing on them. But, I mean, I actually used those for a few years. I don't know. He was somewhere where there was a business card machine.
That's funny.
But I vaguely remember we had some at Reciprocal Recording when we first opened. I never used those. And now I haven't had a business card in so long because it's just word of mouth anyway.
Yeah.
Why do I need to, you know, I mean, if someone remembers my name, I just say, go to my website and there's like instructions on how to contact me, you know what I mean? If you know my name, you already know my website, so.
Yeah, that's easy.
Yeah.
How did you end up working with the Soundhouse, and how did that come around?
This place, well, Scotty Crane, who built this studio in 92, from the ground up, actually, this building was, it's not a repurposed warehouse.
Wow.
It was built to be a studio right from the get-go.
Yeah.
I mean, this was just the backyard of that house. He built the place in 92, and back in the 90s, he somehow managed to find this niche of recording a lot of industrial bands. And he got, like, the Skinny Puppy guys would come down there's some guys who would come down from Vancouver, BC, and record here all the time. And this is before people had home studios.
Right.
You know, the early 90s, he had a lot of business where people would come in here and they would pay like top dollar for studio time. And then toward the, you know, around after the year 2000, his business was totally tailing off. And he was like, Jack, what do I do? And I said, look, you got to lower your rates. This is not the era that it used to be. People don't have that kind of money. The budgets have dried up. The grunge explosion is over with. The circus has left town. Everybody's got home studios. You got to drop your rates by half, and I will bring you some business.
Yeah.
And it worked. He said, "Oh my God, you saved my business." You know, he just had to.
Cool.
You know, it was a business reality. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can't charge $800 a day anymore for a studio.
Right.
You know, at least not if you want to have lots of business. And
Yeah.
you know, so you know, and then when Hanzik Audio, Chris Hanzik decided he would just go for a mastering thing entirely, and he got,
Right.
you know, the building that he had down in South Ballard, actually, some developer, somebody came along. Anyway, he lost the building, and he just said, "That's it. I'm just going to do mastering from now on." So I didn't have private radio to record in anymore. I didn't have Hanzik Audio anymore, and so I moved all my business up to Soundhouse here.
Yeah.
And then eventually the house that is in front of the studio came up for rent. And I thought, well, you know, that could be convenient, you know. So I've been renting the house in front of the studio now for a
Yeah.
decade. And
That's amazing.
yeah, and kind of keeping it running. Scotty doesn't own it anymore. A guy named Mike Sebring owns it, but he's great, and just, you know, he's, "Oh, it's not broken, don't fix it," you know.
Gotcha.
So we keep the place going. And Steve Fisk lives up the street, and
Right.
he comes about once a month and does something, because he
Right.
does a lot of, like, he'll get the band in here and do the loud
Big stuff.
and then go to his home studio and
Right.
you know, hack away at it and mix it at home, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So-
And that's a model a lot of us didn't see coming, or well, not I say we probably knew it, but a lot of people that were running bigger studios didn't see that coming.
No, because you don't need that giant infrastructure for mixing.
And
You literally
tracking one
need
instrument.
you
or-
need like
yeah.
2 speakers and a computer at this
Yeah.
point in order to mix,
Yeah.
and a room big enough to not have standing waves.
Yeah.
But you know, all that stuff with the giant tracking room and, you know, all the soundproofing and everything, well, it's irrelevant to mixing. So
Yeah.
it's like 2 separate functions.
Right.
You have the tracking studio with the square footage and the acoustics and
Right.
the space and the headphones and all that stuff. And then you've got the mixing studio, and they can be completely separate.
Right.
So, you know, the so-called big studios, I think, are, you know, their main advantage is for tracking, really. Mixing is like, you know, you're paying for all that stuff while all you're doing is using the control room. So I could see
Yeah.
yeah, you know, so the studios that are still around are, you know, doing a lot of tracking.
Right.
And I mix in this control room all the time because I'm very, very used to the acoustics.
Right. Are there other engineers that work out of here? Is the door open for freelancers?
It is, yeah. Freelancers are welcome in here.
Yeah.
If they, you know, usually maybe we give them a discount on their first day that they come in. He's like, you know, they got to learn.
Yeah.
I'll, you know, give them an intern or whatever to make sure they don't get in trouble. And I mean, I'm renting the house next door, so
Yeah.
well, here's my cell number if you get in trouble.
Run over.
You know, I'll run over and you know, square it away. But
The other day I was like, "Oh, good, I'm gonna do this podcast with Jack," and I'm like, "Yeah, who interviewed him for Tape Op?" It was
I don't
me.
know, it was you actually.
It
Like
was me.
20 years ago or something.
19 years ago, 99.
What?
We put it out in 99.
Really?
Yeah,
I don't know, we're due for an article, I think.
I think so. It's kind of crazy.
And we can't talk about Nirvana, please.
Who? What
Who?
band
Yeah,
is
thank
that?
you. What band? I don't know. I have no
Yeah.
idea. Oh, who were they?
No, it's been talked about.
Tell me about it.
I read that article today about Reciprocal, and
Where was it?
It was online, some local thing. I think like
Wow.
it was
Okay.
a 30-year anniversary or something of
Oh, Jesus.
Reciprocal.
Oh, all right. Probably the northwestgrunge.com or
Yeah.
some such thing where every little anniversary comes up, they always
Yeah, they get excited.
Yeah, they do. Because actually, I think they may think that the anniversary of Reciprocal was June 1st of 86. That may
Yeah.
have been the day we opened, although I thought maybe it was July 1st.
Oh, really?
I'm going to have to go back and look at the log sheets, actually.
Oh, my God.
Because they might be off by a month.
Wasn't it? I don't think they even got the history right. Because it wasn't a Triangle before that.
It was Triangle, yes.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about that. I was like,
Well, different people, different gear, different
yeah.
owners.
I mean, it's always different. The space, It's
Yeah.
interesting that a space keeps getting used, passed along.
I still have the nameplate that was on the door that says Triangle Recording.
Oh my
It's
gosh,
sitting in my kitchen up on the wall.
that's pretty funny.
Pretty hilarious, actually. They left like stationery and stuff. I still have a few pieces of Triangle stationery sitting around somewhere.
Oh,
Yeah,
God.
Triangle was a funny story. The Reciprocal building is this wedge-shaped, like pie-shaped triangular building down in the sort of Freelard area between Ballard and Fremont.
Yeah,
It's still there. I think Chris Walla has been running it for a long time. I don't know if he's
Yeah.
still the guy running it, but I think he is.
last time I was there, he had done a lot of work.
He'd done a
fixed it
lot
up.
of work on
Yeah,
that
it was
building,
really
which
nice.
is kind of shocking for a building that I don't think he actually owns.
Yeah, I
But
don't think
the
so.
the land trust that owns it, Sammis Land, I don't think they have any plans to do anything with it.
Yeah, it won't turn into condos.
No, it's such a weird shaped parcel.
It is
Actually,
really
it's
weird
just a
shaped
really
lot.
strange shaped building. The whole plot of land it's on is just this little pie, this little triangular thing. But
Yeah,
it was, I remember when that building, because I had set foot in it like once or twice when it was Triangle, because I lived really close to it. And then I remember I heard from an engineer who used to work there. His name was Ben Goldfarb. I don't know where he is now, but I talked to him. He said, oh yeah, the building's like, you know, the owners like basically suddenly just closed it by surprise. Like literally the engineers showed up one day and like, you know, there was like a note like, yeah, we're, you know, moved to Montana or something like that. The original owner just like showed up with a U-Haul and just like crowbarred everything out of the walls and just took all the gear and like moved to Montana like overnight. Just
Wow.
like, we're done. The studio, it was the middle of the summer and they still had a year to go on the lease.
Oh my gosh.
And you know, and somehow I got wind of it. Then, you know, I called up Chris Hanzik. We had just done the Deep Six record. Now I was only in a band.
Yeah.
He was the engineer.
Right.
And I was in Skin Yard and we were in the Deep Six sessions. But I knew that Chris had lost his studio space because he had an earlier version of Reciprocal in the Interbay area here.
Right.
That only lasted like a year or less until his building got sold and he lost his space. And that was the first Reciprocal recording, which was where Green Rivers Come On Down and the Accused Martha Splatterhead EP and a couple other, you know, he had a few bands from that year. It was like 84 that he had recorded in that period, and then suddenly he was like out of a studio again. So for about a year and a half, he didn't have anywhere to record other than he was like an outside engineer. He worked at Ironwood, whatever. And I got wind that the Triangle studio space was suddenly vacant. Nobody knew where the owner had gone with the gear. It was empty, and it was just a mystery.
Yeah.
So I got the key. I managed to get the key from Ben Goldfarb, and we took a look at it, and then we found out who's the landlord. We got to get a hold of the landlord. Well, you know, and so I had to get a hold of the landlord. His name was Sam Israel. He lived in Eastern Washington.
Yeah.
He hadn't been in Seattle in like 20 years or something crazy, you know, and he controlled this land trust that owned all these buildings. He's an old guy, and they had all these buildings all over Seattle, which they still do. Sammis Land. They're a huge real estate owner still, as far as I know.
That's awesome.
And so I got a hold of the guy on the phone, and I explained, like, well, look, you don't know who I am, but there's this building you own, and the client has disappeared, and we'd like to move into the building, you know, or I mean, the tenant, I mean, not client, you know, and he was like, well, okay, well, you know, so I had to find, so well, you got to find the old guy and get him to write a letter assigning you, it's authorizing you to assume his lease, you know. So I had to track down the guy. Bill Stuber was his name. I had to track him down in Montana somehow. I got his phone number and got a hold of him and said, look, here's what we're doing. We want to, and he was like, yeah, you can have it. Go ahead, but I'll do whatever you want, you know. And so we
wash his hands of this.
Yeah, he totally washed it. So he had some kind of midlife crisis and just decided he didn't want to be in the studio business anymore.
Yeah,
he was losing money or something.
I can understand.
Yeah, you know, he just snapped one day and just literally just took all the gear and left the state. You know, so we had to get a letter from him and you know, and I got the landlord. So Chris Hanzik and I basically assumed his lease for the rest of the year because it was a year-by-year thing, and we moved into the building and with all of Chris's gear and a little bit of my gear. I said, look, I found you a building. Can I be your partner? Yeah. You know, because I've got clients who want me to take them out of my basement. Yeah. And you've got gear that used to be in this other studio you had, so let's get. And so we had the 8-track recorder, the Atari machine.
The one that was in the EMP, right?
Yes, exactly. That was Chris Hanzik's old 8-track machine, and he eventually sold it to me. And you know, that was how we got our start in that Triangle building. It was very strange. For a couple of years, people would show up looking for their tapes from Triangle.
From the old studio.
We didn't have them.
Right.
It was empty. Yeah. You know, it's like, well, I recorded a record here in 1983, and I wondered if you still had the, you know, we're just like, sorry. Yeah. You know, like, okay. Some guy came looking for his piano at one point. Whoa. Like, this was like 3 or 4 years later.
I never realized that was how it swapped out, you know, how it turned into Reciprocal.
It was very weird, actually.
Yeah, that's kind of weird.
It was kind of weird because I lived like a couple blocks away, and the real irony is like the month the studio opened, I had to move, and I ended up like way up in the U District somewhere. Nice. Like literally the month we had a studio in Ballard, I was no longer 2 blocks away from the studio. But whatever, you know. Yeah. Yeah, that was a strange story.
Yeah, that is so funny. It's well, it's I think it's always interesting. You know, like I know the history fairly well of this city just from osmosis and hanging out with everybody for so many 30 years or whatever. Yes. And you know, I've been learning the Portland history for 25 years or something. And that's a whole different thing. With
it is
like Northwestern, where they did like Louie and stuff like that. That you talk to older engineers, you start learning stuff. And it's kind of fascinating to see. I mean, because it was a different landscape when, even if you wanted a demo, in quotes, you couldn't even knock it out in your house very easily back in the day because there weren't very many things you could even record on.
No, even cassette decks was like, my first multi-track was 2 cassette decks and a Y cable.
Yeah.
I'd run 2 channels into one and copy them to the other cassette deck and then record the left channel would be,
Yeah.
And that was like early multi-tracking in like 1974.
Exactly.
In my basement, and each time you did it, the speed change would get because one machine was slightly faster than the other, so the pitch would go up each time. And hiss would get louder and louder.
Oh, yeah.
So you'd end up with 4 or 5 channels mixed together on one side, and then the latest channel would be on the other side of whatever was the last pass you did.
Oh, that's funny. I had a little Radio Shack mixer that ran on a 9-volt battery.
Oh, bonus.
That to
You were
bounce
smart.
around.
You had a mixer.
I built a mixer when I was in high school.
Ooh.
Like a passive summing.
I hate to tell you, but I did the same thing, and it's down in the basement
You
right
still
now.
have it?
I still have it.
Oh, nice.
It's hilarious.
I wish I kept all that stuff.
Oh, it's my first mixer. It's literally just some pots and some switches.
Yeah. It's just like I was
It was labeled with, that label tape, the sticky label tape with the little thing. You'd
embossed.
click the little embossed thing, and you'd stick it on there. It's covered with that.
Mine was all Sharpie and on a piece of wood or something like press board.
Yeah.
You've got the one of the interesting things about you is that you've got an electrical engineering degree years ago, and is that
I did. I graduated with a BSEE from the University of Washington in 1980.
Yeah. Do you feel like that was gave you a sort of a grounding, at least in signal flow and electronics and stuff that helped you as an engineer?
Well, no, the irony is that actually when I was in college, I majored in electric power.
Right.
I didn't major in audio. They weren't even really. They weren't even in the late '70s. Nobody was interested in audio in college. They did. You get one course in it, and then whatever. That's it. Now we're gonna.
Yeah.
Now you're gonna.
They explain DBs to you. Or
yeah,
something.
I mean, everybody was either getting into digital, where the sort of digital end of the electrical engineering thing was getting really strong then, and then it was you're either going to go into computers with this in some way, or you're going to go into something else like electric power, and it was audio was just no one cared about it.
Yeah.
And so I majored in electric power and ended up working at the Naval Shipyard in Bremerton for 2.5 years.
Oh yeah.
And I learned a lot about aircraft carriers, and I learned a lot about aircraft power systems, because aircraft carriers have separate power systems for the airplanes.
Really?
And airplanes, a lot of them run, at least military ones, they run at, we have 60 cycle power that we use for everything in our domestic world, 50 cycles in other parts of the world.
Right.
And here's an interesting thing. If your AC power is running at a higher frequency, the transformers you can make to transform from AC to DC and so forth can be a lot smaller and have less iron.
Right.
So avionics, which is the term for aviation power, a lot of it runs, at least back then, this was 40 years ago, but I mean, avionics was running at 400 hertz.
Wow.
And so the aircraft carriers would have power systems for their pumps and motors and vent fans and whatnot that was all 60 hertz like we're used to, where you have giant transformers. And then there'd be separate systems which were strictly for the avionics, which was for the airplanes that take off and land on the aircraft carriers, and those are 400 hertz. And you'd go by a compartment and you'd hear the transformers.
Yeah, I was going to say.
The transformers make this humming noise that's like a whine, from the 400 hertz.
Right,
of
harmonics.
And the transformers are smaller, but they make this crazy, audible noise. It's just a lot. I ended up learning a lot of this stuff, and you learn three-phase, which is this crazy power system that most normal people don't ever have to think about.
Right.
So I retained all the knowledge having to do with transformers and frequencies and so forth, which helped me a lot because I do everything with a spectrum analyzer.
Right.
I've always carried these audio control spectrum analyzers around with me.
Yeah.
I have two of them. One's out here, one's in my house.
Yeah.
And, they go everywhere with me, actually.
Yeah.
And I've always enjoyed having the little picture of the whole frequency spectrum. It's like I have a live Fourier transform in my brain, which is like some obscure electro-engineering knowledge at this point, but I still remember what it meant.
Yeah.
So, and other than that, as far as the electronics, I had to teach myself most of it.
Yeah.
And, but it means I'm fairly fearless about problem solving because most problems are, bad grounds and loose solder joints. I
mean, anything, switches, things that break.
Yeah, it's always something
the
physical.
Brushes with inside of a potentiometer.
Yeah, no, and the thing is knowing how to do the problem, knowing how to eliminate variables and track the signal flow, which is, that's something that's valuable for what I've retained. Because I've only retained about 2% of what I learned as an electrical engineer in college. It's all gone.
You're not dealing with three-phase
No, I'm
power.
not dealing, I can't remember how to do differential equations or any of that nonsense. It's like, but I know how to follow a schematic, and I know what the things do, and I know what I can fix and what I can't.
Right.
When is it time to call in a professional?
Yeah. You mentioned earlier when we were walking around the studio that you repair your own guitar amps or modify them, whatever.
Constantly. I love tubes. Tubes are great. I learned. I had to teach myself tubes. This is the beautiful thing if you're a tube geek. There are these books from the 40s and 50s, the RCA. There's one that RCA made called the Radiotronics Designer Handbook. And the whole first couple chapters is like a primer on this is how tube circuitry works.
Right.
And it's written for the idiot. And then there's a whole section of examples of typical circuits. And you look in there and you're like, well, there's the Fender Champ circuit, they copied it out of this book.
Right. Everybody's reference.
Yeah, everybody was using that as a reference in the 40s. That was the reference, and you can find this book anywhere. And then the RCA, the tube guides that that have a page for every tube.
Right.
You know what I mean? I actually know how to read that stuff.
Yeah.
So, working on tube amps is like working on an old pickup truck.
Yeah.
Because it's old technology. It's really easy to get in and get your hands dirty. There's the components are so few. It's kind of magic that they were able to do so much with so few components.
Yeah.
It's well, here's the engine, here's the piston, here's the spark plug, here's the distributor.
Yeah.
And here's the carburetor. Well, that's kind of how an old Fender Bassman from the 60s is. That's kind of how the circuit is.
True.
So I kind of enjoy that aspect of it. It's real, get your hands dirty kind of stuff.
And watching you play last night, playing guitar, I was remembering back to first seeing you play in Skin Yard. And I know.
Oh boy.
But the thing I've always, especially back then, the thing that was really interesting about you was that your tone wasn't shrill. Remember 80s guitar amps and high gain pickups and circuits, everything was about shrillness to me.
I am
in the guitar shop,
I'm always on the lookout for the pain frequency.
Yeah.
Which is usually some variation on 2.5K.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And it's usually a little sliver of a whistly peak. And a lot of guitar tones literally have this whistly tone.
Oh yeah.
And it's really interesting if you show people. I'll do this thing with EQ where I'll turn the Q up to 10.
Yeah.
So it's just a spike, and I'll turn it to plus 14, and I'll sweep it up and down the frequency spectrum.
Yeah.
And while we're listening to a really loud distorted electric guitar.
Yeah.
And there's a spot, you sweep it up and down, and there's a spot where literally suddenly the meter goes shooting into the full red, and everyone in the room clamps their hands over their ears, and you're and you look at everything's in the, and you kind of go, that's the pain frequency. That's where there's a whistly, resonant spike in the sound that is not musical.
Right.
There's nothing musical about it. It's an artifact of the interaction of the pickups with the tube circuitry. That just generates this spurious whistling tone.
Yeah.
And people don't realize it's there until you remove it.
Right.
So you notch it out, reverse it, minus 14, whatever. It's literally just a little knife slice in the audio spectrum. And you say, okay, and you switch it on and off. And as soon as you do that, you switch it back on, everyone hears it now. They go, oh my God, there it is. You suddenly hear this and you remove it out. And so basically, if you can find these painful resonant spikes that are non-musical, and notch them out carefully, not too much, or it gets to sound unnatural. You can make it sound dull because it's part of the tone is having that. Your ear is used to hearing a guitar and hearing these little shrill things, but you can get that under control, and it allows you to turn the guitar up much louder in the mix without hurting your ears. Suddenly you're like, oh, because you get a mix and you hear it and it's like everything's real tinny and there's all this shrill stuff going on. You're like, oh, it's just not fun to listen to. It's painful. Well, you couldn't really do this that easily with analog EQ. You can do it with digital EQ. You can zero right in on the frequencies that are non-musical.
Tight cuts like that with digital, I've noticed.
Yeah, you can notch out the problem frequencies, and it allows you to turn up the nice frequencies much louder in the mix without it suddenly fighting with everything. And I'm really sensitive to that in my tone as a guitar player. I know what a shitty guitar sounds like, and that's not what I want. I want a nice round distortion that's got some sustain, but that you can still hear the picking and it's not hurting anyone's ears. Here's the thing I learned actually about basic tube circuits, the typical tube circuit that is used in the preamp of most tube amps. Each time your signal goes through each tube stage in the preamp of your amp, it flips the signal 180. Then the next stage it flips it back, and then the next stage it flips it back. So say you've got a Fender Twin. It's got an extra tube stage in one channel, which is the reverb mixer. It allows the reverb to get mixed into the signal.
Like a buffer.
Yeah, and that flips the signal, the phase. So, when you're plugged into like the clean channel and the reverb channel in, say, a Fender Twin, the one's 180 out of phase with the other.
Oh, weird.
And so if you're like combining two amps together, it's a guess like how many tube stages has this Marshall got versus this Fender that I got here. So, the two speakers may be completely out of phase with each other when you combine them together. So
amps next to each other.
Yeah, and if you're putting them next to each other, the air in the room is like sucking and pulling, and it's like it's much better to. So I always have the phase flip speaker cable. So instead of just flipping it on the console, I can actually flip the phase in the room, in the air, before I record it. It's actually a valuable. This is just one of those things you just like, when you figure it out, you're like, oh, why didn't I think of this years ago?
Oh yeah. You mentioned problem solving earlier, and that's that sort of thing where there's so many things to be aware of, when you're recording an artist, and every instrument has its own things that can go wrong.
Oh my God. Yes.
And it's just amazing when you stumble across something like that you're not expecting. It should be all
just like,
should be all correct.
Stop the session. Wait, something's freaking me out here. What's going on? Am I losing my mind? And it always turns out to be some weird thing that nobody knew was happening.
Oh, it's massive.
This is one thing I retained from college was my basic understanding of acoustics and my basic understanding of electronics. It's like I know Ohm's law like the back of my hand. E equals IR, you know what I mean? Comes in handy. I know the resistor color code. I memorized it early.
Yeah.
And then like the basic acoustics, which is that high frequencies are like a laser beam. Low frequencies diffuse around corners. They're almost omnidirectional.
Right.
And all the variations in between for the middle frequencies. So when I'm like positioning mics on a drum kit, and I have to show interns this all the time because they know which mics I like to use, and I go, okay, go out there, and they'll set up the mics, and then I'll go out and I'll change where all of them are pointing, because say the mic's here, it's at the rack tom, but it's kind of pointed in a certain way, and I'll go, look, you want to not get hi-hat into these mics. You don't want the ride cymbal getting into the floor tom mic. You don't want the hi-hat getting into the rack tom mic or the snare mic any more than you have to. And think of these as flashlights.
Yeah.
Think of these microphones as flashlights. So you're pointing this mic, and whatever the light is illuminating, that's what the mic is going to pick up.
Right.
So just look at the way this mic is pointing. So you got a mic, it's pointing at the rack tom, but it's like pointing across it at the hi-hat. And you're like, no. Move it over here so it's not pointing at the hi-hat. You know what I mean? Simple things like that you don't really think about until you think about this is directional. You want it pointing at the things you want and not pointing at the things you don't want.
Like putting the hi-hat mic, so it's in the hi-hat is, the snare's in the shadow of the hi-hat, so to speak.
Right, so you're mainly getting hi-hat and not snare.
It's not, there's no way, the mic can't even see the snare.
Right.
So,
exactly.
There's another trick a friend of mine showed me a long time ago, closed head, kick drum, and he goes, and we had like an RE20 or something, he goes, just don't point it at the head, point it across the head. you'll pick up more surface.
I finally had a live sound guy point that out. It was Jim Anderson, actually, a sound man of some incredible pedigree here in town, who said to me, look, here's what you do, because he gets that live. Sometimes people show up with no hole, and I'm always just like, oh, God, there's no hole in the kick drum. What the hell? It's going to be a big washy whoomp sound.
Right.
But that's the thing, is apparently you put the mic on the floor, pointing up across the heads, and you're thinking, well, it's going to get a lot of ride cymbal, but you can build a tunnel, with some foam or whatever.
Piano bench.
Yeah, that kind of thing, right? The piano bench with some cloth over it or whatever you need to do. And and then if the outer head is ringing too much, and you don't want your kick drum to go boom, boom, you can take a little pillow with a brick,
totally
lean it against the bottom of it a little bit, control the resonance.
Talking about all my techniques.
All the techniques, I know. It's like we've been doing this a while.
Yes.
We've all independently discovered the wheel, in various ways. So I'm not as terrified of a kick drum with no hole as I used to be. It's still, if it's a heavy rock band with distorted guitars, it's like, look, you want the kick drum to cut through those nasty, bright, shrill guitars, I need attack.
Right.
And here I've got a head already with a hole in it. Let's just swap the head, and then we'll put your head with your logo back on it after
if
we're
it's
done.
someone that wants to sound like the Sonics or someone that's playing jazz,
then it's fine.
It's great.
I did the Sonics in here, and they didn't have a head with no hole, or they had a head with no hole, but the guy was wailing on the drums, and it was great.
Right?
It was killer, but at the typical metal band, it's like, no. You need that attack, or you're not going to hear the kick drum through those guitars.
Right.
Oh my God, the Sonics, they were like such founts of history.
That sounds fun.
That's a fun band, man.
Oh my God.
They were characters.
Yeah.
There's like a lot of characters floating around this town.
Yeah.
And your town as well.
Oh yeah. It's kind of the joy of it. Is it fun working with something like that where they've been around for so many years?
It's a little intimidating.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The funny thing is I've worked with at least one of their grandchildren has been in the studio.
Grandchildren?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, 3 generations. I ain't getting any younger myself, I guess, okay.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, it was.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, it is. So the context here for those listening in podcast land is Larry and I were just at the Central Saloon in Seattle last night, where my band MKB Ultra was playing right before Chris Novoselic's band Giants in the Trees.
Right.
At the Central Saloon. Now, Chris probably has not played in the Central. Of course, it was the Central Tavern back in the day. He probably hasn't played in the Central since, no later than the early 90s.
Yeah.
Because
if even
then, because by the time Nirvana got famous, they weren't playing the Central Saloon.
Yeah.
So it would have been no later than 1991. My band Skinyard used to play in the Central Tavern back when it was one of the only 3 clubs in Seattle that you could, that an original band could play in the mid 80s. I mean, we opened for Faith No More in 1987, I think it was. The original lead singer, I think they had a couple indie records on Mordem or something like that.
Right.
And, they were a big indie band. And I'm pretty sure we opened for the Flaming Lips there, too, around the same time. And again, they were like a weird indie band.
Yeah, Chris' band,
Giants in the Trees.
Yeah, you helped them. You went down and helped them set up some recordings.
Yeah, because they were recording on their own, and they had like a whole setup in this house, that they were recording in, and and they're kind of novices at it, but they were like enthusiastic novices, and they had all this gear, and the drummer had like this. He was using Sonar or something like that, and had some PCs and some interfaces, and Chris had some preamps and a smattering of. He had a closet full of old microphones and mic stands, and there was all this bass gear, and Ray Prestigard. He's got like 10 different like weird hollow body handmade instruments that he plays.
Oh, cool.
These little lap steels and dulcimers and all these kind of. He's got a whole. It's just into that stuff, and so there's all this stuff they had, but they didn't. They had to sort of learn from trial and error how to actually record themselves.
Yeah.
So I'd be like, okay, no, wait a minute. First, you got to tune the drums a little bit, and then you got to put the mics here. As long as you put the mics here, it'll work.
Yeah.
We don't have time to be experimental because I can't come down here all the time.
Right.
And, but if you do this, it'll work. And so and then they took that and ran with it, and then I basically ended up mixing the record, you know, that they recorded. And, you know, at first it was like, you guys really should record this one again. You know, the drums are all blown out, the preamps are all in the red. Like, no, you got to like the meters, you got to, you know.
Yeah.
And so, and then they got really good at it. And also, you know, they'd record the song again a couple months later and be, oh, we're way better playing the song now, because the band itself was becoming a band.
Yeah.
You know, where they were just kind of jamming, and then, well, let's write a few songs, we'll record them, and then like a few months later, oh my God, we changed that arrangement, it's way better. So, you know, it took them a while, but eventually there was an album. And it actually sounds really good for a home recorded record. I ended up mastering it too, because as usual, what happens is they sent it to some expensive guy in LA, and the guy squashed the life out of it. And then I was like, you know, wait a minute, let me master a song. If you don't like it, it's free. And of course they went with my master.
That's
you know, which this happened over and over again.
Yeah.
You know, and if people don't like it, I'm just like, okay, whatever, take it to somebody else.
That's pretty interesting. Does that happen a lot?
It does. It's happened to me a number of times where I've basically had records where they send it to someone to master. Not Chris Hanzik. I send stuff to Chris Hanzik all the time.
Yeah.
But occasionally people are like, oh, we've got like this guy. I'm like, yeah, okay, this guy. Okay, let me know what it sounds like. And it comes back and it's like, my name's going to be on this? No, wait a minute. Let me try mastering it myself. And if, you know,
kind of crazy.
you can, I'll do it for free. Okay. Yeah. Just so we don't have to use this, you know, pay that guy off and then let me take a crack at it. I've done this a couple times.
Wow.
Because it's like, I want, you know, if it's a record I'm really proud of, I don't like it when people completely destroy it, because mastering is it's like mixing. It's a very unregulated field. Anyone can buy a computer and an interface and some plugins and say, I'm a mastering engineer now. I read Bob Katz's book. I'm a mastering guy. And it's just like, well, how, you can't buy ears. I'm sorry.
No.
You know, so I'm really frustrated with mastering because of the number of times I've had to basically do triage on somebody's record at the last minute. Like, wait, we just spent like weeks in the studio and this is the master?
Oh, yeah.
Wait. Just hold everything, you know. Oh, fuck it. So by necessity, I had to learn how to do mastering to like rescue these situations where somebody had like sent it to somebody who had like terrible ears that apparently were drastically different from mine.
I think there's also, even sometimes with skilled mastering engineers, I think they have PTSD from their clients.
No, I think
everybody keeps saying louder, louder, louder.
Well, there's that.
Yeah,
that's true, and I understand that. It's like you just say, look, just back it down a couple dB and run it again, and it's, you know, even the big shots are like, oh, really? Oh, that's it's one of great, you know. They're like, I thought you wanted it smashed, you know. Think of the guys doing major label like System of a Down records or whatever.
Those have to be just so loud.
Yeah, they're like, when you tell them that you don't have to do that, they're just like, oh, thank you, you know. But that's not the same as just being incompetent.
No.
You know what I mean? That. And it just frustrates me sometimes. Yeah. So, you know, I don't want to gripe too much, because I know some people are really good at it. And but yeah, mastering is tough, you know, because you can spend like weeks and weeks on a record and then somebody can screw it up in like a day. And then it's like, no, wait a minute. You know, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm gonna take something I got from Stephen St. Croix years ago, and this is a guy who used to write for Mix Magazine. He's one of the best writers that they had. Yeah, because he always had something really thought-provoking, and one of the things he wrote, and I wish I knew where this column was, because it was the best column he ever wrote. To me, it was like, it rang huge alarm bells in my head, which was basically, he explained like literally everything you do with the signal of any kind of processing or any kind of conversion or whatever is lowering the resolution a little more. Yeah. You're making it a little blurrier every time you run it through anything.
Oh, yeah.
And it's all about, you know, resolution is basically like clarity. And I think of it in terms of, and I used to think of it in terms of like a photo negative. Mm-hmm. If you have a photographic negative and it's like, picture like, you know, some kind of camera format that had like a giant negative.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the one when you print the picture and you blow it up to like, you know, 3 feet by 3 feet, everything's in crystal clear detail.
Right.
Instead, you had these little like 110 cartridge cameras and 126 cartridge, but like a little tiny, you know, the negatives were these little postage stamp size things. And if you tried to like, you could get those developed and they'd make a nice little 3-inch by 3-inch photo. Right. But if you tried to blow it up, you could see that it was all blurry. The resolution was not there because the negative, it's like you're down to the level of the atoms and the molecules in the photographic negative, and it can only hold so much detail because it's a tiny little thing. And it's the same thing I try to explain to people, like the inner part of a vinyl record is not going to sound as good as the outer part.
Right.
Because the music is squeezed into this much smaller surface area.
There's less land.
There's less space for the grooves, and it's the detail's not going to be there.
Yeah.
So don't put the loudest song at the end of the side. And, so for me, every time somebody talks about mastering in the analog domain, where they take like a digital master and they run it out through a converter to some manly thing or whatever, and then back into a converter, back into the digital world, I'm just like, okay, so right off the bat, you're blurring and smearing the whole thing. You're making it more lo-fi as part of your modus operandi.
Yeah.
I don't roll with that. That's not something that I feel like should be like the first thing you reach for.
But on the other hand, I have worked with mastering. I worked with one quite frequently who does generally use an analog path, and it does sound better.
Oh, yeah. Some people swear by it. They've got the gear. God bless them. They've got the converters. They've got the stuff's high resolution.
Super high, yeah.
It's top of the line.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. No, analog still has its place, but just not on everything.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. You can make something sound worse, and it's a resolution issue.
Yeah, it's almost like an effects unit at this point. It's
Yeah.
like, that tape machine over there, that's an effects unit. Do we need it? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. Like the whole magic sauce is because we're hitting tape.
Yeah.
It's like, well, no, the magic sauce is not sucking.
Yeah.
And if the tape is, the tape is not going to make or break it. You know what I
No.
mean? It's like, and in fact, if we don't use the tape, we can probably get the record done a lot faster, and you can spend a lot more time getting good performances instead of like going back and punching in things and taking hours and hours dealing with punch-ins. But
It's interesting.
This is the thing. Recording is all about time. That's almost the most important ingredient in the studio is time.
Yes.
I mean, beyond a certain minimal level of technical competency from the engineer and a certain minimal level of functional recording, gear, recording functionality.
Yeah.
The most important ingredient is time.
Always.
It's like, are you rushed? Do you have time to play the song right? Do you have time to do another take?
Right.
Do you have time to relax and like calm your brain down and get a good performance?
Yeah.
Or are you fighting with the gear and fighting with the recording methodology the whole time?
Right.
You don't want to be doing that. You want to be able to concentrate on your art. And the more that the technology gets out of your way, the better a performance you're going to make. And the sound, sure, the recording methodology affects the sound, but I think the performance is a much more important part of it. Yeah. And I think the time spent is a much more important ingredient than this or that particular piece of equipment. Larry, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Indeed.
Awesome.
I will shake your hand. I'm shaking his hand. You can't see it.
Yes, this is the handshaking.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't seen Larry in a while.
It's true.
I just don't get to Portland that often.
Thanks for listening. Find us online at tapeop.com, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Until next time.